Okay, so now we are on chapter 3, which is the hypothetical social contract theory. So, 3.1, I like how he has these broken down like in almost outline form. So, the traditional claim that individuals have consented to the state cannot plausibly be defended. That's what we covered last time. Hypothetical social contract theorists turn instead to the claim that individuals would consent to the state under certain hypothetical conditions. To me, that's a really big stretch. Now, this is a fun thought experiment, but that's about it. And there's a footnote here that says most modern hypothetical contract theories are meant to explain something broader than political authority. They aim to account for the part of morality that concerns what we owe to each other. He goes, for the purposes of this chapter, I shall suppose the theories of such contemporary thinkers as Rawls and Scanlon adapted so as to account for the foundations of political authority. So he notes that the modern theorists go beyond mere political authority, but since the smaller subset is the concern of his book, that is what he is going to be dealing with. It says, defenders of any hypothetical social contract theory must complete two tasks. First, they must show that people would accept the social contract in their hypothetical scenario. Second, they must show that this hypothetical consent is morally efficacious in the sense that it generates obligations and ethical entitlements similar to those generated by valid actual consent. Ooh, we can already see this is going out on a limb. But he then does give an example where hypothetical consent is morally efficacious. So let's go over this. He says there are circumstances in which the fact that someone would have agreed to some procedure can render it permissible to perform the procedure where the procedure is of a type that normally requires consent. Suppose that an unconscious patient has been brought to a hospital in need of surgery to save his life. Under ordinary circumstances, physicians must obtain the patient's informed consent before operating. In this situation, insistence on this principle would preclude the application of life-saving medical care, as the patient is unable to either consent or dissent from the treatment, or dissent, I guess is the way it would be pronounced here. And in such a case, it is generally acknowledged that the doctors should proceed despite the lack of consent. The most natural explanation appeals to the reasonable belief that the patient would consent to the life-saving procedure if he were able to do so. And so I think that's reasonable. Something he'll bring up later, I'm pretty sure. Though, say the unconscious patient is wearing a bracelet that affirmatively says they don't consent to anything, well, then the hypothetical consent of a alleged reasonable person is overcome. So, it says there are two necessary conditions for the moral efficacy of hypothetical consent in such a case as that of the unconscious patient. First, the obtaining of actual consent must be impossible or unfeasible for reasons other than the unwillingness of the other party to consent. So second, when we appeal to hypothetical consent, here's, I guess, this is what's going to be consistent with what I just said. The party's hypothetical consent must be consistent with their relevant actual values and philosophical beliefs. Hypotheticals that require alterations of the subject's fundamental beliefs and values, even if some of those beliefs and values are misguided, are irrelevant to establishing morally efficacious hypothetical consent. So he then susses that out with something very obvious here. Agreement on any social contract would require modification of the philosophical beliefs and values of at least some citizens. Among the individuals on whom government is imposed are some who, on philosophical grounds, oppose the general form or style of government to which they are subject in favor of some other form of government. Say somebody would prefer a monarchy to a democracy or vice versa. And he says others, oppose all forms of government in favor of some form of political anarchism. Section 3.3, I think we skipped 3.2, which was hypothetical consent in ordinary ethics. We didn't skip the section, I just skipped the title, but 3.3, hypothetical consent in reasonableness. On some philosophers' views, when a strictly voluntary system is unfeasible, an acceptable approximation may be a system about which no one has any reasonable complaint. And the fact that a political system would be the focus of an agreement by reasonable persons under ideal conditions of deliberation might be thought to show that no one has a reasonable complaint about it. And then he continues, advocates have offered no evidence or reasoning to show that some particular political system would be agreed upon by all reasonable persons. They exert considerable effort to describe the conditions that they believe would establish the legitimacy of a political system, but they make no serious effort to show that any political system satisfies these conditions. One possible explanation for this omission is that no government satisfies the conditions for legitimacy. So he says, in everything examined so far, hypothetical contract theory appears less than an actual grounding for political legitimacy than a promissory note for such grounding. That's such a clever statement. But then he does his own pushback and says, consent to the social contract need not include consent to every detail of the state's structure and operation, but it must at least include consent to the basic form and most important governing principles of the state. But he says, unfortunately, at least unfortunately for the hypothetical consent theorists, even this basic level of agreement seems unattainable. Just as there are seemingly intractable disagreements about religion, philosophy, morality, policy issues, there are seemingly intractable disagreements about the general form, structure, and guiding principles of government. There is no reason to think that all reasonable people will achieve agreement on the basic principles of government any sooner than they reach agreement on the correct religion, the correct moral theory, and so on. In fact, there remain thoughtful and reasonable individuals who believe that the optimal social organization would contain no government at all. Hello. The fact that these individuals remain a minority of society, unfortunately, is of little comfort to the hypothetical social contract theorists who aim at showing all reasonable people would agree to the social contract. Anarchist thinkers do not, as a rule, appear particularly less rational, informed, or reasonable than partisans of other political views. They do not, for example, refuse to offer reasons for their views, refuse to consider objections, or refuse to take into account the interest of others. It is therefore difficult to identify any non-question-begging rationale for excluding them from the class of people whose agreement is sought. I love this. Unless anarchists are simply to be excluded from the agreement, hypothetical social contract theorists owe us an account of how political anarchists could be convinced to accept government. The legitimacy of a political system is a matter of the permissibility of imposing that system on all the members of a given society. He says the reasonableness of the offer, he gives an example Okay, I probably should have highlighted this. He gives an example of how reasonableness alone isn't enough. Suppose someone offers you a job, and it's a reasonable job at a great rate of pay, yet you decline it. Can you be forced to accept it? Because no reasonable person would decline it. He said the reasonableness of the offer, together with hypothetical consent, would bear very little weight, at most slightly mitigating the wrongness of imposing forced labor. The unreasonableness of rejecting an arrangement does not suffice to generate an obligation to comply with the arrangement. Now, he does his own pushback, and I like when he does this. So he gives a different thought experiment which somebody in opposition to him could offer. He says, contrasting intuitions may be drawn from another analogy. A shipwreck has stranded a number of people on a hitherto uninhabited island. The island has a limited supply of wild game, which may be hunted for food but must be conserved against extinction. Okay, he's going to defeat it through other means, but immediately I would go, lifeboat scenarios are edge cases, and you can't make general principles from hypothetical lifeboat scenarios, particularly ones that are not going to happen. It's like if a Martian comes to Earth and says, unless you rape this woman, they're going to destroy the entire planet, would you rape the woman? It says, assume that the only reasonable plan is for the shipwrecked passengers to carefully limit the number of animals harvested each week. Despite these facts, one passenger refuses to accept any such limit. It seems plausible to hold that the other passengers may coercively restrain the unreasonable passenger from excessive hunting for the benefit of all on the island. Furthermore, the reasonableness of limiting the rate of hunting and the unreasonableness of rejecting such limits seems to play a crucial role in the justification for such coercion. What is the difference between the island case and the employment contract case? The most important difference is that the employment contract case involves the seizure of a resource, the employee's labor, to which the victim of coercion has a moral right, whereas the island case involves the protection of a resource, the wild game over which it is plausible to ascribe a collective right, held only partly by the coercee but mostly by the coercers. And yeah, you can make a lot of other arguments this way. Didn't he say a hitherto uninhabited island, so therefore all of them have kind of homesteaded it and are like tenants in the entireties. The unreasonable passenger in the latter case lacks any moral right to decide unilaterally on the use or distribution of the wild game, and in the way that an individual has a moral right to decide on the use of his own labor. And then he notes, our attitudes towards government differ from our attitudes towards other agents. The unreasonableness of rejection clearly does not license a private individual to force the terms of some contract upon another individual. Yet the unreasonableness of rejecting the social contract is thought to license the state to force the terms of that contract on its citizens. What the hypothetical contract theory gives, then, is another example of the particularly lenient moral attitudes applied to government rather than a justification of those attitudes. One must begin by ascribing some special moral status to the state to believe the state morally entitled to force an arrangement on individuals merely because they would be unreasonable to reject that arrangement. Agreed. All right, that's going to be enough for this one section of recording for me. I'll be piecing together. We'll be probably doing another section, so you'll see an outfit change, as you do. All right, it's the next day, and we're going to continue. 3.4, hypothetical consent and ethical constraints. So he starts getting into John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. He says, Rawls devises a hypothetical scenario, the original position, in which individuals form an agreement on the basic principles to govern their society. These individuals are assumed to be motivated solely by self-interest, but they have temporarily been deprived of all knowledge of their position in society and indeed of any other personal information about themselves, including their race, sex, religion, social class, and so on. This condition, known as the veil of ignorance, prevents the parties from tailoring the chosen political principles to their own advantage. Being ignorant of what one's position in society will be, one must endeavor to devise principles that are fair to everyone. Rawls goes on to argue that people in this original position would choose two particular principles of justice to govern their society. He concludes that people should, in fact, adopt these principles. And Professor Humer goes on to say that he's omitting the two principles and his reasoning for them at this point because his concern is whether Rawls's argumentative strategy can be deployed to defend political authority. So, though Rawls does not directly address the need for government in general, one could devise a Rawlsian argument for political authority. It might be said that the parties in the original position would prefer to establish some form of government rather than accept anarchy. If one could make a compelling argument for this claim, would this suffice to establish political authority? It says, it's natural to ask, if an agreement is never actually entered into, why should we take any interest in the principles? The answer is that the conditions embodied in the description of the original position are ones that we do in fact accept, or we do not, but perhaps we can be persuaded to do so by philosophical reflection. All right. So he says there are two strands of argument in the Rawlsian passages. A first appeals to direct constraints on putative principles of justice. He mentions two important constraints of this sort. First, principles of justice should be fair to all members of society, treating them as equals. Second, principles of justice should leave aside, or more strongly, compensate for, aspects of the social world that are arbitrary from a moral point of view, such as the situation of individuals receiving benefits or burdens as a result of mere good luck or bad luck. The second strand of argument appeals to constraints on arguments about justice. And the third quotation, and we didn't read all the quotations, just know that he did do some. Rawls suggests that rather than envisioning a scenario involving people ignorant of their identity, deliberating about the rules of their future society, one could achieve the same result simply by reasoning about justice in accordance with certain restrictions. Namely, that one avoid being influenced in the arguments or principles one accepts by anyone's natural fortune or social circumstances. That one avoid tailoring the principles of justice that one accepts to one's own case, and that one avoid being influenced by particular inclinations or a particular conception of one's good. The original position is nothing but an imaginative device for inducing us to think in that way. So, that whole hypothetical of people behind the veil of ignorance is basically saying, now, that was just a thought experiment, but when we are in the real world thinking about these things, we should operate as if we were under the veil of ignorance, that is the right way to constrain, almost like Nozikian side constraints, to constrain our thinking about justice. All right, he continues, can this agreement, though, be reached? He said, There is an assumption that rests on a particular diagnosis of the phenomena of widespread intellectual disagreement, that such disagreement is due entirely to such factors as ignorance, irrationality, and biases created by a knowledge of one's individual characteristics. If that diagnosis is correct, then a situation in which such ignorance, irrationality, and bias are removed should result in general agreement. But if that diagnosis is not correct and there are other sources of disagreement, then Rawls has given no reason for believing that agreement would be reached in the original position. A more plausible diagnosis of widespread and persistent philosophical disagreements is that human beings experience differing intuitions and other intellectual appearances. And I think Humer is absolutely correct here. He says, consider one disagreement of particular interest. And he keeps revisiting this topic, obviously because he's an anarchist himself, as am I, so it makes it particularly interesting to me too. The disagreement between anarchists and statists about the necessity of government. There's no reason for thinking that this disagreement would evaporate behind the veil of ignorance, because Rawls has given no reason for thinking that those who in fact hold either of these views do so only because they are relying on knowledge of their particular position in society. Anarchists do not disagree with statists because anarchists have some particular social position or combination of personal traits that somehow would enable them to prosper in the absence of government while the rest of society fell apart. If the anarchists are correct in their factual beliefs, then some stateless system would be better for society as a whole than a governmental system. If they are wrong, then it would be worse for everyone, anarchists included. Whatever explains this particular disagreement, it is not that someone is tailoring moral or political principles to his own advantage. In fact, I know anarchists that today receive the benefit of certain government assistance because maybe they have some disabilities, but they still don't believe those things should exist in a truly just society, that they should be provided charitably, but that the government today has taken over that role. So it's not because every anarchist views themselves as some kind of like survival of the fittest warrior. I certainly don't. Nor do I presuppose that political legitimacy requires agreement on all details of policy. But presumably agreement on whether there should be a state or not is the minimum that any social contract theory requires. And I'm just looking, there might actually be 3 more sections. I mean, this is the second one, but there might actually be a third one, because this was a very densely packed chapter. And he says, the appeal to fair outcomes. He said, one way of reading Rawls' justification for the original position is as an appeal to direct constraints on principles of justice. In particular, the constraints that principles of justice should be fair to everyone and that they should rectify moral arbitrariness in the distribution of advantages. He says, the fact that some hypothetical agreement is fair or rectifies moral arbitrariness does not, in general, create an obligation to act according to the hypothetical agreement, nor does it create an ethical entitlement to coerce others to follow the hypothetical agreement. Perhaps Rawls would respond by observing that his principles of justice were meant to apply only to the basic structure of society rather than to small-scale interactions between individuals, because you can easily rebut his positions by just talking about small-scale interactions. He says, but Humer goes on to say, the difference, however, has no ethical relevance. If a very large corporation makes offers to a very large number of people, the corporation's sheer size will not entitle it to force individuals to accept its offers, even if they are fair offers, any more than a single individual would be entitled to do. The other distinction is political. My examples involve private actors, whereas Rawls' principles prescribe action by the state. This distinction, however, cannot be employed in Rawls's defense without begging the question, since the reply simply presupposes that the state possesses some special moral status, such that coercion on the part of the state is more easily justified than coercion on the part of private agents. If the state possesses political authority, then this presupposition would be correct. However, since what is sought is a justification for authority, one cannot take it for granted in this matter. Correct. It would be a tremendously circular argument. Because there's a wide gap between what a hypothetical agreement might plausibly be taken to establish, such as the fairness or reasonableness of some arrangement, and what the defender of political authority needs to establish, that there is a right to impose an arrangement by force, including the right to intentionally and coercively harm those who fail to cooperate, and the obligation of individuals to accede to that arrangement. While an actual agreement might establish these things, a mere hypothetical agreement cannot. All right, we are going to move on to at least a part 3. And I think we will get through it in a third part, which will not be as long as this one, but I like to do these notes fresh. If I start to get tired, then I don't offer my particular asides and commentary. I might even record the third part later today, but it's nice to take a little break. I like recording these in 10 to 12 minute chunks. Okay, we're in the final segment for this session. Who knows? Okay. This subsection's called The Validity of Hypothetical Consent, Sufficient Conditions for Reliable Moral Reasoning. It says, though it's plausible that the constraints Rawls identifies are necessary conditions on the reliability or rational persuasiveness of moral reasoning, Rawls makes no attempt to show that they exhaust the conditions for reliable or rationally persuasive moral arguments. So there could be other, got my hair all caught up in my glasses, there could be other conditions. He doesn't show they are all of the necessary conditions. And it's plausible they're necessary, but are they exhaustive? A related difficulty concerns the gap between procedural acceptability and substantive correctness. Even if Rawls succeeded in identifying all of the appropriate procedural constraints on moral arguments, a person's satisfying these constraints, failing to be biased, failing to commit fallacies, and so on, would not guarantee the correctness of his conclusions. You could do that and still be incorrect, is basically what he's saying. And then he continues with necessary conditions for reliable moral reasoning. Okay, he gives a syllogism that's going to be very difficult to describe here. So I'm just going to try to summarize the points without having to lay out the syllogism. So, in saying that there are these certain necessary conditions or certain necessary constraints, you could show that a particular conclusion is consistent with those constraints. But that doesn't mean that conclusion is right. So, in other words, just saying that these are constraints doesn't mean that it will automatically rule out incorrect conclusions. And he, like, for instance, says, there are many philosophers who seem to have reached alternate conclusions by reasoning that satisfies the constraints. The various thinkers who embrace utilitarianism, egalitarianism, libertarianism, or anarchism do not in general appear to have violated any widely accepted constraints on moral reasoning, nor does Rawls anywhere endeavor to show that they have. So then it goes on to the conclusion. Hypothetical agreement is normally efficacious only when actual agreement cannot be feasibly solicited and it is reasonable to believe that the relevant party or parties would agree based on their actual general beliefs and values. These conditions are unsatisfied in the case of the hypothetical social contract. Even if such an agreement could be reached, the mere unreasonableness of someone's rejecting an agreement or arrangement does not typically render it morally permissible to coerce that person into accepting the arrangement, nor does it impose on individuals an obligation to accept the arrangement. In any case, the mere fact that an arrangement is fair, he's just repeating himself again, he just repeated himself. He goes, the hypothetical agreement might be thought to show that a set of moral principles reflects certain reasonable constraints on moral reasoning. These constraints might be intended either as collectively sufficient conditions or merely as collectively necessary conditions on the acceptability of a piece of moral reasoning. If the constraints are to be sufficient for the acceptability of moral reasoning, they must include a condition of complete and correct values on the part of the reasoner. But this condition would render the hypothetical contract theory unusable, since one would need to determine the correct comprehensive moral theory before one could determine the content of the hypothetical agreement. If, on the other hand, one relies only on necessary conditions for the acceptability of moral reasoning, then one must argue that every political theory but one somehow violates at least one necessary condition on acceptable moral reasoning. No one has argued for that claim, and the actual reasonable disagreements among theorists seem to pose powerful counter evidence. So that is that for that chapter. I think he did a really good job. The next chapter 4 is the authority of democracy. Yay, my favorite subject. And let's see how many pages that is, because that's what we've been doing to know what we're getting ourselves into. And it goes for 19 pages. By contrast, this last one was like 22 pages. So, I mean, they're very similarly in length chapters. All right, we'll go on to the next one.